On Grace's wedding day, an unexpected event would disrupt the course of her day. As she was preparing to walk down the aisle, Grace's loyal German shepherd, Hugo, stepped firmly into her path. The guests, who had been buzzing with excitement, suddenly fell silent. Hugo, her constant companion, the one who had shared her happiest moments and her deepest sorrows, seemed determined to stop her from moving forward. Grace's eyes fixed on her dog, and a chill ran down her spine. She wanted to tell him everything was fine, order him to step aside, but a glance into his brown eyes was enough to convince her that something was wrong. Hugo stared at her with a look almost human, one she had never seen in him before. No growl, just a silent, persistent presence. "Hugo," Grace whispered, her voice trembling, but the dog didn't move. The tension in the air was palpable. Grace's wedding dress fluttered gently around her, while her father, visibly agitated, stepped forward, pulling on the leash. "We have to move on, Grace. It's time." But the dog let out a soft growl, causing even Grace's father, a usually determined man, to hesitate. This wasn't a defensive growl. It was a growl of distress. In a state of worry, Grace knelt down, ignoring the murmurs of the guests. She gently placed a comforting hand on Hugo's head, stroking him softly. "What's wrong, my beautiful boy?" she whispered, her heart pounding faster with each passing second. Minutes passed, but she couldn't take her eyes off Hugo. This dog who had been with her through every stage of her life, who had protected her when she felt alone, who had watched over her during times of doubt and pain. This same dog now seemed to be trying to tell her something she couldn't quite grasp. A wave of panic swept over her. "Grace, we don't have time. The ceremony needs to start," her mother urged. But Grace heard nothing but Hugo's labored breathing. Her thoughts were elsewhere. She remembered a young Hugo, trembling and hiding under her blankets during a thunderstorm. She remembered him by her side during her most painful romantic moments. She remembered him running joyfully through the park the day she met Lucas. Suddenly, an idea flashed through her mind like lightning. She placed a hand over her heart and stood up quickly. "We're going to the vet." A hush fell over the crowd. The guests, though confused, seemed to understand. Her fiancé, Lucas, looked at her, concerned but resolute. "I'll go with you," he said without hesitation, taking control of the situation immediately. Under the surprised gazes of the guests, Grace, still in her wedding dress, helped Hugo into the car. Lucas quickly grabbed his phone to call the vet, while Grace's father explained the situation to the priest. The car sped towards the veterinary clinic. Grace cradled Hugo's head on her lap. Her wedding dress was wrinkled and stained, but she didn't care. The outside world no longer existed. Only Hugo mattered. His breathing grew weaker, and each breath seemed to be a struggle. Lucas glanced frequently in the rearview mirror, his face tense with worry. When they finally arrived at the clinic, Dr. Peterson, Hugo's longtime veterinarian, was already waiting for them. He guided them inside quickly. Grace, almost forgetting the presence of the others, carried Hugo in her arms. The scent of disinfectant and bread in the clinic filled the air, creating a strangely reassuring atmosphere. The vet laid Hugo on the examination table, his movements precise and professional. Grace, her hands trembling, stayed by his side, gently stroking his fur. Lucas put an arm around her, trying to comfort her, but Grace's pain was evident. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. Finally, after what seemed like forever, Dr. Peterson looked up, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Hugo is suffering from advanced heart failure. The stress of the day has worsened his condition. The medication may help him feel more comfortable, but he only has a few months left." Grace's world shattered. She stood slowly, approaching Hugo, her heart broken. "Is he in pain?" she asked, her voice trembling. The vet shook his head gently. "No, not right now, but stopping you from walking down the aisle, that was his way of telling you he needed help." Tears began to roll down Grace's cheeks. She leaned down and rested her forehead against Hugo's. "I'm so sorry, Hugo," she whispered. Lucas, in a calm voice, gently pulled her from her sorrow. "And now? What are the next steps?" The vet briefly explained the treatment plan, but Grace wasn't really listening. Her thoughts were consumed by grief and confusion. It was then that the clinic door opened and her father entered, followed by her mother, the priest, and Sophie, her maid of honor. Upon seeing the scene, her father immediately understood. "We thought you might need support," he said, placing a hand on Grace's shoulder. A heavy silence fell in the room. Sophie, always the pragmatic one, took out her phone. "We can still have the wedding here at the clinic with Hugo by your side," she suggested, her voice soft but full of conviction. Grace looked into Lucas's eyes, seeking an answer, but she found only understanding. "It's not what we expected, but if it works for you, then let's do it." In an instant, the clinic transformed into an impromptu wedding venue, filled with emotions and warmth. The guests gathered around as the priest began the ceremony, creating an atmosphere of tenderness and love. Hugo, lying at their feet, wagged his tail slightly, as if he understood the moment perfectly. When Grace and Lucas exchanged vows, Grace's heart was filled with a deep certainty. This wasn't the wedding they had imagined, but it was perfect because it was surrounded by the people who mattered most. When the priest finally declared them husband and wife, Hugo let out a small bark, like a silent blessing. The evening that followed wasn't the one Grace had prepared for, but it was filled with warmth and love. As they both sat on the floor of their apartment, still in their wedding attire, sharing takeout Chinese food, Grace looked at Hugo, his head resting on her lap. She smiled, a sad but grateful smile. Months passed and time with Hugo became increasingly precious. They savored every moment, every smile, every stroke. But one spring morning, Hugo made it clear that the time had come. They spent the day with him in the garden, under the blooming trees. The last thing he heard was their voices. That evening, the house was silent. Grace sat at the kitchen table, staring at Hugo's empty basket. Lucas gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You gave him a life full of love. He always knew how much he meant to you." Grace nodded, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. "He taught me so much. About loyalty, about love. I miss him so much." In the weeks that followed, they honored Hugo's memory, not just with words, but through actions. The memories they had of him would never fade, and his legacy of love would remain forever etched in their hearts.